So welcome everyone. Today is the BMRC Summer Fellows Talks, and I will announce the Fall Fellows Talks, but they're scholars who came to Chicago in the summer, and we are welcoming them to discuss the research that they were able to carry out over the summer with BMRC Fellowship. So today, oh goodness, sorry. Today we are honored to have Cotter Christian. Cotter Christian is the Dean an associate professor at the School of Constructed Environments at Parsons School of Design. Former associate dean and director of the BFA of Interior Design program, he brings professional experience in commercial design and holds degrees in studio art, interior design, and theater. His research explores how mindfulness and contemplative practices in design education can foster creativity, collaboration, and engagement with social and environmental justice. And he is also the co-creator and host of Decorated, a podcast that uncovers overlooked stories and histories within interior design and decoration. Will Fryer, who's also joining and was a co-researcher on this grant from the BMRC, is an interior designer, researcher, and artist from Brooklyn. He currently teaches interior design at Parsons School of Design and previously taught architecture at CUNY City Tech. Will's design practice is focused on finding deeper meaning in residential design. In addition to renovation and furnishing, his conceptual practice includes drawing, sculpture, and video. He recently showed the conceptual work Queer Clouds, a joint exhibition with Will Eatough, I'm not sure, at Compere Collective. Will also writes and produces Decorated with Cotter Christian, the podcast that we earlier discussed. So today, Christian Cotter and Will Fryer will be presenting about research they did about, under the title of Intersecting Margins, Amplifying Calvin Ashford's Interior Design Legacy from Chicago and Beyond. Before we turn the floor or screen over to them to present their research, I would just like to welcome everyone and introduce everyone to who maybe not be familiar to the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, which is a consortium of 28 libraries, archives, and museums in the Chicago metropolitan area. And we seek to cultivate and steward a network of all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences in the area. So you can see here the names of our 28 member institutions, from small, what we call community archives, to larger academic libraries and museums in the area. One of our staple programs we've done since 2009 is our Summer Research Fellowship, and you can see that Cotter and Will were part of this cohort for the summer of 2025. We're really excited about the work that fellows go on to produce. Some of the things, yeah, obviously there are a lot of journal articles. There's also plays, books of poetry, and then here are some select publications. So far, we've seen at least 30 publications, 30 books published from the research done by fellows, and to date, we've given at least 100 and I want to say 30 fellowships to people to do research on different aspects of life in Black Chicago. And so we invite you to support our work. Your funds go directly to things like our fellowship program. So if you wonder, like, where does the money go? So that's something that we would appreciate if you have the opportunity to support that. And for people, those interested, we do have a few more talks left from people who did research in Chicago this summer. The next one will be coming up on November 21st. With Sophia Sanzo Davis, who will be presenting on the legacy of Margaret Burroughs' Black archival and cultural stewardship practices in Chicago South Side. But without any further ado, I will now turn the floor over to our guest today.
Thanks so much, Sumaya, and we're gonna share our PowerPoint now. So give me just 1 second while I do that. Great. Hopefully you can see our screen and it says Intersecting Margins, Amplifying Calvin Ashford's Interior Design Legacy. So hi everyone, and thank you for being here live and watching this on YouTube. We want to start by framing what this presentation is and what it isn't. So this is our in-progress research, and we're sharing it while it's still evolving. A lot of what you'll hear today comes not only from our own analysis of the archival material, but also from interviews that we've been conducting. So you're going to hear other voices alongside our own. And our aim in this project is simple. We want to bring Calvin Ashford's overlooked legacy forward and places work into broader conversations about identity, race, and design culture. And we want to show where his story fits within the larger narrative of who gets remembered in design history and who hasn't been. And so Sumaya already did a really great job introducing us, but there's our pictures. And Will can offer some additional context and share with you our current work.
Yeah. So we were very excited to receive the BMRC Fellowship because studying the legacy of Calvin Ashford is an important piece of this broader project of diversifying design histories. Decorated is a podcast and oral history project launched in fall of 2024. The purpose is to uncover overlooked and marginalized stories in design and decoration, focusing specifically on voices that have been excluded from traditional academic narratives. So if you're not familiar with the field of interior design or interior design as a discipline, it's often compared to architecture, and interiors have been, and still are to some degree, dismissed and considered not as meaningful as architecture. Decoration in particular is discarded by academia. It's not considered to be an intellectual pursuit, but rather viewed as superficial, taste-based, one step away from shopping. That's part of it. That's not the whole story. So one reason interior design has been dismissed is because it's thought of as a feminine practice. Another is that until fairly recently, practitioners often didn't have formal training. So we're trying to undo the hierarchy of what is considered meaningful and address the larger issues that are at play in interior environments, such as gender and sexuality, class, elitism, and race. On the whole, race has been very little addressed within the discipline, but of course, it still shows up in interiors in all kinds of ways. The podcast is also an important part of our research and teaching practices. Oral histories are an important pedagogical tool for us, particularly design as biography, understanding spaces through lived experience. So again, we're looking for meaning beyond aesthetics, beyond the surface, trying to understand what do interiors mean, how are our beliefs and values imbued or encoded in the spaces we create.
And so we want to connect the fellowship to our current work and past work. The goal really is to, as Will mentioned, bring overlooked designers into the conversation that we're already having with students and on the podcast. We see really interior environments as cultural documents themselves, and understanding designers' lives helps us explain the choices that they made in their work and how they show up. The fellowship gave us a chance to ask deeper questions about race and identity within design. And looking ahead, we really hope that this research will help us build a public-facing resource, will shape future courses, potentially workshops, and share more of our process from the archive to the interviews and the ways that we interpret design history.
So Calvin Ashford. We first found out about Calvin Ashford through Jack Travis's essay, An Interior of Inclusion, or The Illusion of Inclusion, where he calls Ashford perhaps the first Black celebrity designer. Uh, Ashford was an under-recognized pioneer of late 20th century interior design. He was one of very few Black designers represented in design archives. He had an extremely impressive client list, including Diana Ross, Dionne Warwick, Whitney Houston, and Maya Angelou. In spite of that, he was hardly published in design publications, what we call shelter publications like Elle Decor or Architectural Digest. Studying Ashford and the world of Black interior design in the 80s and 90s is intersectional in many ways. First, interior design itself is somewhat marginalized academically. And so when marginalized communities practice in a marginalized discipline, they disappear from history. The impetus behind our work is to listen to and record histories that have been overlooked. We're both queer, so discussions of sexuality and space came quite naturally to us. Race, of course, is outside of our personal experience, so it's more of a challenge for us to study. But inclusion is one of the core values that we teach, and it was important to us to address race in the podcast, and Calvin Ashford became sort of our way in. His achievements, including graduating college at 18, clearly show that he was hugely intelligent. He chose to practice interior design instead of microbiology, instead of science. So he obviously saw design as stimulating and challenging. The fact that he chose to make his mark, as it were, in design, to me means that he believed interior design was meaningful.
And so a bit of the timeline that makes up Calvin's life that we were able to piece together through the archive and other research. Some things really stand out immediately, and I think that what's really exciting to me is that he took a kind of convoluted path to become an interior designer. He studied art at Columbia University in New York City. Our understanding is that he was there as early as age 16. After that, he apprenticed for a designer, an interior designer in London, and moved back to New York City, where he found it very difficult to find employment as an interior designer. So after giving it a go for a short period of time, he went back to the Midwest and got his Master of Science in microbiology, and then a PhD later in microbiology as well, and was prepared to become a professor of microbiology when one of his instructors noted that their wife was looking to decorate their home and had mentioned that Calvin had an interest in this and gave him that job. And from that point on, he was an interior designer and decorator and no longer pursuing microbiology. It was in the 1970s that he founded his his firm, Gilmore Ashford Powers Design in Chicago. And throughout his career, which spanned really the 1970s to the 1990s, was sort of the peak, he designed these high-profile residences in Chicago, in New York City, in Palm Springs, in Florida, and Atlanta. Clients such as Maya Angelou, Whitney Houston, Diana Ross, Jalen Rose, Joan Howard, and many others. And in 1990, he received the Chicago Design Award and founded the Black Interior Design Association in 1998. Calvin died of cancer at age 73 on June 24th, 2008. And I'll just mention that the Chicago context also really matters here because he built his practice at a time when Black professionals were gaining visibility in creative fields and was part of that energy. So forming his firm, Gilmore Ashford Powers, and situating it within Chicago's Gold Coast wasn't just opening up a studio, it was a way of really claiming space in a profession that didn't always make room for Black designers. It was really important for us to better understand the context of finding employment in interior design as a Black person in the 1970s, especially given what was noted about Calvin's experience trying to find employment in New York City. So during our time in Chicago, we were introduced to Jocelyn Oates, who is a former interior design professor at Columbia College in Chicago, who agreed to be interviewed about this or for this project. And so here she's talking about her experience as a young designer in the 1970s in Chicago. And this is where, okay, I have to make sure the sound
I
works.
got a job offer from the chairman and dean at that time, John Mulvaney. And he explained to me, he said, maybe this is a good direction because as a young Black woman, you're probably not going to have the job security that others would have. And I'm like, what? I've worked really hard to get here. What are you talking about? But I thought he's absolutely right, because there were very few of me. And it was clear that even though I thought I was competent and I was learning to be a good architect, I probably was more dispensable than others. And I had already found that out when I left undergrad and I was starting my interiors career, which is when I ran into Calvin Ashford. When I got here, I guess I didn't realize how difficult it would be to actually secure a job. This was in 1978. Often when people would talk to me, they might not realize I was African American, but when I would go to the office, and it wasn't always denial, but it was often shock. So, and some people were very open to hiring me and interviewing, and other people were not. The shock kind of held them back.
Jocelyn was also the only person we were able to connect with who had professionally interacted with Calvin. And so here in this brief moment, she describes her interactions with Calvin during her time working at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago.
But anyway, but I started out working in the Merchandise Mart because, you know, I kind of couldn't get a job anyplace else. But it was fascinating. I'm so happy I started there because I learned so much about the whole wholesale industry. And it was there that I began to become in contact with all these other interior designers, or actually decorators, in Chicago. There were very, very few Black designers doing high-end residential design at the time. And nor did I see many Black designers, virtually none outside of Calvin and Gwen, come into the, you know, Merchandise Mart at the showrooms.
So you met Calvin while you were at the Merchandise Mart.
Right.
What do you remember about him?
I mean, so, you know, I'm 22 years old. I mean, I thought I
Right.
was enamored with him in the sense that he was a Black male doing interiors. His clients were as elite as anyone else's when he would come in with his clients. He was flamboyant, though. He was, he, he was, he had an exaggeration with style, and he did it well, you know. But he definitely enjoyed, I think, being seen. Um, he had a very polite manner, very dignified, sometimes theatrical. But he was, yeah, I just thought he seemed like a very creative, uh, I'm going to say somehow a little enigmatic. I mean, I think he wanted you to kind of wonder about him a little bit, but maybe that was the whole persona. But he seemed very creative. He seemed to have good knowledge about what he wanted in terms of his aesthetics, which I guess, you know, that comes from the client. But he seemed to come in and know exactly what he wanted in the showroom. But anyway, so.
And so we'll see a little bit more of that theatricality soon. And obviously he shares that a bit with his family. So while Calvin was unquestionably a hard worker and a consummate professional, it also helped that early in his career, he was Nick Ashford's brother. So the success of Ashford and Simpson opened doors and introduced him to high-profile clients and gave him an early platform from which to establish himself as an interior designer. And there were several clippings in the archive which showed the relationship that he had with his brother and sister-in-law. In our process, we worked through the archive at the University of Illinois Chicago Daily Library, Calvin's papers, as well as an archive of materials related to the American Society of Interior Designers, or ASID. Calvin's collection came from an effort that was led by Victor Magellan. The archive exists because students of Magellan's pushed for greater representation of Black designers, which is also an important part of the story. We paired that with oral histories from people who we knew or worked with Calvin and others who could paint sort of a larger context. So here's a list of some of the people that we've talked to so far who have offered us either recorded interviews or at least given us more information of where to look. We also spent time really looking at the images of his interiors because we're treating those photographs as cultural artifacts. They show how taste, identity, and aspiration played out in his work. Methodologically, this is really a blend of design history and oral history, and the archive gave us that framework. The voices add some dimension, and the interiors themselves help us see what all of this means in practice.
So our driving research questions, first, why is there a dearth of content? Why were more Black designers not published in magazines like Elle Decor or Architectural Digest? And we'll get to that a little bit, but I think it led us to believe that there was a lot of design happening, but perhaps it was happening more informally or not consistently recorded or not published in the typical way. Also, what is a Black interior? This is a question that is not possible to answer, but is rather an avenue of inquiry and leads us to look for attitudes and practices around interior spaces in Black communities. Some of the challenges looking at that question are that typically we see our understanding of an interior is rooted primarily in the photos that we see, the finished, polished photos, but those don't necessarily tell the whole story, because identity is imbued into an interior space through practices that don't necessarily show up in a photograph. And lastly, in order to understand this topic, we might need to broaden our understanding of the field itself. Creating homes and other interiors that are authentic to identity is crucial to interior design, but we might actually have to change the way we think about interior design in order to understand these authentic space-making practices. Yes. Okay. So our understanding of Ashford's work comes through the photos of finished spaces in his archive. And we spoke about these with Jacqueline Carmichael, who is professor of interior design at Howard University. She's also author of Defining the Black Aesthetic in African American Interior Decoration in the Home Environment Through Art.
Thinking about Black aesthetics, Black interiors, Black architecture, things of that nature. I raised the question to my students. I said, how do we define, Black architecture, Black, interiors beyond just what we were just talking about aesthetic? Is it that it's because it's occupied by that Black body, or is it that we would know it if we see it, if it is looking at color, representation, improvisation, as we mentioned earlier? But it is just getting the information out that these are spaces that are created by these Black interior designers. And so we don't have all the information that we need to do that investigation. So that, again, gives us 100% deficit in that arena that we should be. Because again, as you think about all the cultural aesthetics that we have here in the United States, when you look at music, dance, it does have that African context. It provides the foundation. You think about rock and roll, you think about punk rock, you think about any music, well, even country music. There is an African historical, it's proven context to that. So there is, again, when we think about Egypt, the African diaspora, there is some context and historical references, even Picasso going back and pulling those aesthetic attributes to where we see design going now. When we think about modern design, it's based off of that information. So again, if students are not privy to that information, it does put them at a deficit. And then it gets to thinking about other, and we do not want to do other being less than, and we can't have that, knowing that, oh, we are the progenitors of it.
And I just want to point out in the video with Jacqueline, all those images were images of Calvin's work that were in the archive. So a variety of different residential projects that he had worked on and chosen to collect. So what really stood out to us in the archive was how much of Calvin's design life happened outside of the studio. So developing a social network appeared to be part of his practice. Who you know, who you show up for, and how you move through a community, all of that is a kind of design work too. It shapes the opportunities, the visibility, and the way a designer might build trust with future and current clients. The archive made this very clear. Most of the materials weren't drawings or floor plans. They were invitations, programs, and documentation of events that he attended, often with Norma Barnes, who we would love to know more about. But we have struggled to find any information about her, but she shows up in a lot of these different photos. What was saved shows how active he was in the Chicago design and social scene. He was present and he was visible. When we talk about Calvin's professional practice, we're also talking about that network that he cultivated. Being engaged in the community was part of how he built his career, how he stayed connected, and how he positioned himself in a field that didn't always open those doors equally. And this wasn't just being social, this was really being strategic and a meaningful way to work as a designer. One place that Calvin was acted professionally was within the organization of Black designers. So the archive included programs, invitations, and photos that show he wasn't just kind of loosely connected to these organizations, but he participated. And in this case, he was recognized by this group for his contributions. In order to understand this context a little bit better, we spoke with Shauna Stallworth, who was one of OBD's co-founders, to help us understand how important the organization was at the time, and how it gave Black designers visibility, support, and a sense of community.
It was very innocent, to be honest with you. It was like, why don't we see representation in magazines? Because that's where you know, as designers, we're all reading magazines, from Vanity Fair to Vogue to all the design magazines, of course. And we had been attending the annual furniture show called NeoCon in Chicago. We'd also come up to the New York Design Show at the Javits Center, and we just couldn't figure out what was happening and why people weren't getting published. Because that's when you see your colleagues. That's when you see work from every persuasion. That's what I used to say, just from every persuasion. And we couldn't figure out, do our Black designers not seeking publication, or they are publishers not reaching out? And quite frankly, it comes down to who you know, right? You call the people you know, or who you socialize with. And if you're not socializing with a diverse population, and at the time people were not, or there were very few. I don't think it was anything malicious, quite frankly.
Right.
I just think it was not seeing others who've been practicing, who have a very affluent clientele, or maybe not even affluent, but we're doing design at a local level. So two things were happening at that time: not seeing a lot of people published, hearing of designers, seeing a few at NeoCon and other design conferences, and sort of seeing each other like, hey, where are you located? Right? That's what you do. Right? Where are you located? And one night, or it was a series of evenings, we were working late. We were all working for a design firm, an architectural firm, and said, well, let's fax some questions to some of these publications. So quite frankly, this was not anything that was so sophisticated or anything. It was strictly, let's fax them and have it on their fax machines first in the morning, asking questions. Why aren't you featuring Black designers or designers of color? It didn't even have to be Black designers. Why are we just seeing white designers in all of these publications? This was to every publication in New York, every design publication in New York City. Anything that we thought, interior design, interiors and sources, it was all these publications. We concentrated on New York because that's the publishing powerhouse of the country. A simple, we can't understand why we're not seeing designers of color. Please explain. Have you searched people? We got immediate response. Well, we don't know any. I'm thinking, in New York City, you can't find one Black designer. I'm finding that, but okay, if you say you can. Anyway, we got an immediate response. And we put a phone number down. So they're calling and saying, well, we do want to feature. We're not being exclusive. We would like to feature. And so then that's sort of how the organization of Black designers was born.
So Calvin's archive was created by Victor Margolin in response to questions from students about the lack of information about Black designers. Compared to some other archives, particularly one we know well is the archive of Melvin Dwork, There we see the lack of publication, so his work was not sufficiently published. We also see a sort of lack of process work. So there aren't a lot of design documents, drawings, sketches, and that makes it difficult for us to understand his creative process, unfortunately. Of course, what we do see is much of his personal life, and of course, these scientific papers as well. Which is quite unique and interesting. You don't often see, you know, a luxury interior next to adrenal-like tumors of the ovary. But yeah, these absences, of course, tell a story of marginalization. They leave us at a loss. It's harder to talk about the meaning behind his work because we have this gap.
So kind of where we're at now is we have the current work of putting together the oral history into an accessible format using the podcast as that medium. And so we'll also keep the full-length interviews, all of the archival material that we're permitted to, in a way that folks can use that as a sort of digital archive. We're also looking into other areas of research that have been spurred from this initial investigation into Calvin. So I want to just briefly point out two areas where we're sort of headed next. One area that we're digging into is how Black interior designers have been represented in mainstream the shelter publications. We're doing interviews, also pulling archival material to understand who gets covered, how they're talked about, and what those patterns reveal about visibility in the field. And just even looking through the Architectural Digest archive and searching Calvin's name, you don't find any of those images, which is pretty surprising. We're also starting a kind of more focused piece of archival research on Tuesdays at Home, which was one of the resources that one of our interviewees connected us to. It's a really interesting moment in history of design media where there was an insert into Chicago and New York and other national newspapers that was geared towards Black homemaking and aesthetics. So it really brings up questions around tastemaking, intended audience, and what stories were worthy of publication. We're gonna, oh yes, next is Marlene.
Mulaney. Yeah, Mulaney, we spoke to Mulaney, who's an artist and designer. She also founded the Black Artists and Designers Guild, which is a platform for Black artists and designers to connect, collaborate, and thrive. And she speaks to sort of a new generation of Black artists and designers. And it's interesting, the reason she founded Badge very closely mirrors Shauna's story about OBD. Mulaney saw a panel at Design Week that did not include any designers of color, and she called that out on social media, and she got a really strong response to that, and that was the impetus for founding Badge. So we spoke to her about her work, and she also stressed the importance of archives.
And Instagram becoming the fax machine of the 21st century.
Yes.
As you know, the archives of Black experiences, it's very fragmented, right? And there are many gaps. And so we wanted to, figure out ways that we could fill those gaps through our experiences. And so by having these conversations, these projects, and even through the work that we were making, that was part of adding to the archive. The archive is really important because as makers, one of the things I always stress is like record everything. The sketches, act as if you're always you're preparing for a retrospective of some sort. You never know when it's gonna happen. But people want to know about those sketches, even the events that you attended. I learned we would bring in speakers who I remember specifically. There was an archivist at the Schomburg Museum, and she talked about how she had folders of artists, living artists, and of course artists who passed away. But in those folders were not just sketches; they had like movie tickets, and so they could start to see what kind of lifestyle these people had, right? So it's important that we create our own and not rely on an institution because there are very few institutions, number one. And number two, we don't own those institutions. And as you could see, funding could be taken away at a drop of the dime. So then especially as people who are involved in space, makers around space, we have to create our own spaces. And if we use our personal homes as the archive to start, that's what we do. It's funny, I'm sitting at my desk and there's a sketch of one of my very first textile designs that I made from 1996. I still have the original tracing. So I keep those type of things. And because I do, you know, my original paintings and drawings have been accepted into the Smithsonian in DC, you know, but again, because I kept these records. So the archive is really important because, especially in this day and age, I feel that I think my generation is like one of the generations that we're not going to have as many gaps as like my mother did. You know, I do have images of myself as a child. I have through grade school. And then once the digital camera came, you know, every moment has been recorded. And I've always said to myself, I want to live my life so nobody could question who I was, what was I about. So I'm really personally big on like recording and creating archives in that way.
So that was, I think, a great way to kind of close where we're at right now. Mulaney's work and the work of Badge has also been recently featured at the Cooper Hewitt, which was the image you were looking at next to the video. You know, as far as our reflections, one, I just want to thank the Black Metropolis Research Consortium and the Daily Archives, as well as our interviewees and folks here at the New School who have helped us as well, and at Parsons, and just thank them for sharing their knowledge as well as their work. We've learned a lot as designers working in archives. I think it's not always a common practice, but for us, it's really allowed us to kind of broaden our impact in how we think about design education, and also how we identify ourselves in a lineage of designers.
We were thinking particularly that, you know, since interior design has been overlooked to some extent academically, it does offer us the opportunity to write our history the way that feels authentic. And so what we're doing here is bringing together oral histories, archives, reading spaces as cultural artifacts. These are all methods that are coming together to tell a story of something that was overlooked. And we think that that mirrors also the way that interior design as a field is about bringing together disparate resources, disparate people and methods and fields. And so we're sort of reflecting that identity in the way we tell the story.
And looking to hear what you think and
Yes.
what resonated with you. So thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I have a lot of questions, but I assume that other people here have questions as well. So I will, oh my goodness. So I will defer to, let's see if there's any questions from the audience. People can also, who are not able to speak, and write their comments in the chat. Well, I have 4 questions here, so I'll start and give people time to kind of think. So a lot of interesting things came to mind. When I was thinking about, you were talking about defining Black spaces, and you said it was kind of impossible that's kind of an impossible thing, but it made me think immediately of housing appraisal, when houses are being appraised, and there's this thing that Black people do to make it seem like Black people don't actually live in their houses, so that, you know, so that they can get a higher value if they're trying to sell their homes. And so there is something they're doing this walkthrough, right, to take away anything that might make someone think that a Black person lives in that house. And so I wonder, and obviously the easy thing is like take away family pictures, but I wonder if there's also aesthetic things that are done. And so there's a lot of documentation about this process, right, of like de-Blackifying your space so that you can get a higher appraisal value. So that was one thing I thought about, and I don't know if that's of any value, but I was wondering if you have looked in the papers of any of his clients, of Calvin Ashford's clients, to see if he comes up, or if his work comes up, if that was something you looked at, if any of his clients have archival records that you could look at. And then I was also wondering if you looked in the Black magazines. Obviously, you were in Chicago, Jet, Essence, you know, those, if any of his interiors were ever focused, or if he was ever featured in the Johnson publications. That was another thing. Yeah, and I also wonder how the person who put together that collection of his materials got those materials. That's another question that I have. So yeah, thank you.
We have the same questions, unfortunately. Yeah, we don't. Unfortunately, Victor Margolin passed away, so we can't ask him where it came from, unfortunately. We did a deep dive on clients, and we found almost nothing. It's what we're taking away is just like the sort of lack of information, and it's really, it is somewhat surprising, I think. I think what you're mentioning about the appraisals and sort of removing traces of identity is super interesting. We haven't actually come across that before, but that is kind of an interesting question that we've come up against, is sort of like in what ways are identity visible within an interior, which aspects are invisible, and certainly one thing from the 70s and 80s that came up was the sort of Africanist art and Africanist sort of objects that they may come from Africa or they may look African, but that is sort of a way that people were signaling identity within interior spaces, for sure.
I would
Right.
just, oh,
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to add that the clients, I think, to a certain degree, because many of them were high profile, they weren't attached to the images. So in the archive, there were lots of images of his work that look like promotional images, things that he may have commissioned to have taken to promote his firm. And so you would see, you know, residential interior Chicago Gold Coast, but it wouldn't list the specific address or the specific client. So for the folks that we did kind of make some connections of, we look through census records and all of these types of things, and really weren't able to trace it back to someone who we could be in touch with.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
The last thing you said about Black publications like Ebony, that is definitely an avenue that we're looking at. They are very interesting to explore. I don't believe Ashford's work was ever featured, unfortunately. We haven't, at least if it was, we haven't found it yet. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously the Johnson Publications Archives is currently being processed and the digital archives is forthcoming. I think it will be definitely obviously worth looking through that, because there's so many millions of photos, images, so hopefully but thank you very much. Maybe someone else now in the audience. Oh, I think Kim, who's one of our board members, has put a question in the chat. Thank you for an interesting talk. Can you please describe his interiors? What were his design influences?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, obviously at the heart of what we do, during the video, you may have seen a number of different pictures kind of changing. Those were all images of his work. And I think what stands out to me is how different they are, right? Like there was very modern, contemporary, lucite banister for a double height space, right? And then there was something a little more delicate, more textury. Things had lots of color, things didn't. The one unifying theme in my mind was really reflective surfaces, which, you know, that was the 80s. So reflective surfaces were popular all over the place. And I think that in some ways, that speaks to Ashford addressing the desires and tastes of his clients over his own personal aesthetic. So I think sometimes you'll see designers who, you know, you can say, oh, that's so-and-so. With Calvin's work, I think it's harder, you know, looking at the myriad of images that we saw, there's not a consistent through line. And I also mentioned that he saw himself as a Black interior designer, but he didn't say that he was designing Black interiors explicitly. So there's something there too, I think, to address, Sumaya, your earlier comment as well.
One phrase that he used in the media when he was interviewed was the Black eclectic. That's a way that he described his work, and I think eclectic is a good word to talk about a lot of his interiors. One thing that interested me is that the internship that he took after college was with David Hicks. David Hicks was a British designer who did really upscale, kind of aristocratic spaces. I wouldn't say that Calvin's work looks very much like David Hicks' work a lot of the time. But one thing that did come up, particularly in speaking with Jacqueline, was the idea of improvisation. And I think that you could think about sort of like in jazz, the idea of riffing or taking a theme or something that somebody else plays and then picking it up and reinterpreting that. You can sort of see that in his interiors. He'll pick up a color, a pattern, a texture from one object, and then that'll show up in another piece as well. So there is this kind of way that the objects are talking to each other in the space.
Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. I'm a fan, and not just because of Ashford and Simpson, but that just made dance. It's wonderful to see not only who this person is, but how he relates to people. And I think that's a part of my question is about, and I have a ton, but I'll just probably ask one or two, is what you just brought up about representing who the client was. And it's the difference between the 80s and now are so stark in some ways, in which designers are about perhaps showing who they are or representing who they are in their work more so perhaps now than they were then. And that perhaps the profession was more geared towards service in the sort of civic sense, right? Or the sense that it might be for that person and not just about me, the designer, capital M. So that's just a thought that I had. But I think my biggest question was about documents. How do you find them? Where do you find them? When do they come up in a search? And, part of one of the things that I find difficult about doing research is that if you type in a keyword and the keyword isn't flagged to be found, that you won't find it. And so for some of these magazines, you have to kind of flip through each and every page to find it, right? Like, why wasn't it set up to be able to search for a particular name? So, that we're trying to play catch up now with the technology, assuming it's there, but we still have to do the sort of donkey work of flipping through. And I wondered if you found that to be the case.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I felt frustrated. I felt like it was sort of ironic that Google says its mission is to make all the information in the world accessible to everyone, but something as close as the 80s, and we can't find any information about it. And we do have to do this physical legwork of going through page by page. That being said, there is something about archival research where you may go in looking for one thing and you may come out finding 3 interesting things that were not the thing that you were looking for. So there is a sort of creative aspect to the legwork as well, I think. I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, and I would say that it also points to the discussion of what's missing. And I think, we tried to capture that a little bit in this presentation, but to me, that's just as important is what was chosen to be in the archive and what wasn't. I think as far as architecture, and I'll say Architectural Digest just because that's we check out the podcast because we have an episode all about Architectural Digest, its history, and as well as photography of these rooms, which is an extremely expensive process too back then. But they have actually a pretty good digital archive. And so when you type in, Calvin Ashford or whomever, you will see what was published most likely. Surprisingly, during this period, there were 2 references to prominent African Americans, Maya Angelou and James Baldwin. There were no interiors featured, but there were articles written by those 2, which about home and about belonging, which I thought was really interesting because, that was an example of in looking for something else, this is the thing that we found, which may not have been, which is kind of one of those other directions. And then the Tuesdays at Home, that publication is another place where, in the archival process, that discovery came from looking for something else and is super exciting, and one that we hope to continue looking into a little bit more. Although that does conflate consumption, consumerism, because a lot of the marketing and imagery, they saw this as a new market, right? Black homemakers, Black consumers. Here's a new place for us to sell things. So much of the imagery that was being produced was in order to sell something, right? So that also gets complicated in all of this, because when you look at something in the archive, I'm on a tangent, but when you look at something in the archive, like one of the images, you're not just looking at the space itself. And I think that's what makes interior design and maybe to a lesser degree architecture archival work challenging and interesting, is that you're seeing a photo of a thing, you're not seeing the thing. And so that's taken through the lens of someone who chose to set that picture up the way they set it up, which also suggests a whole nother layer of value and what's being included and what's not. And so, being able to interpret and read Calvin Ashford's work based on the images that were provided is complicated by the fact that it's through a lens. And so maybe it looked very different when the occupant of that space has their own artifacts in there, right? And so the idea that there's this interior that is pristine is never true. It's always changing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have another question from Kim in the chat. Are there, let me see, are there any images of any of his own homes, any record of significant decorative objects that he possessed or used?
We didn't come across any.
We saw images of his offices. I think I actually suspect that we did see images of his own home. I think that we probably did, but I think that they were not called out as his own home.
Yeah.
Designers often use their own home as a place to show what they can do. And then sometimes present them without telling you that that's their own house. So I think we may have seen it, but we're not sure which one it is, unfortunately. And as far as decorative objects, it's interesting because in other designers that we've covered, there is this kind of lore about the objects of like, oh, I think when during Melvin Dwork, there was a day bed that came from one person, was passed on to somebody else and somebody else. But we don't really have that with Ashford, actually. We haven't come across the records of any specific objects, I don't think. No, yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions? I have one question, but I'll see. Would anyone else like to ask before we wrap up? Okay, well, I was wondering if you looked at the Art Institute of Chicago's archives, if there was anything, because they have extensive records of architecture, and I'm not sure quite about design, but I feel like it might be something that, at least a fruitful conversation or investigation. Did you all take a look in?
We did. We found a lot about graphic design, and there was actually quite a lot of interesting stuff about graphic design in Black communities in the 80s, but we did not find much about interiors, unfortunately.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
And I see that Kimberly asked if he has any living family. So this one's for you, Allison. There is actually a bar on the Upper West Side that apparently is co-owned by Valerie Simpson, yes. And so that's probably our closest to getting a living family member because the others have passed, and he didn't have any children. And so we don't have any direct connection to him. So at some point, we have committed ourselves to going up to Simpson's bar and trying to ask questions about Calvin Ashford's story.
We'll see. There's a fine line between investigative and stalker. We don't want to cross it.
We've tried Instagram, but you can only get so far. Yeah.
What about Norma Barnes, who you mentioned? Is she Chicagoan?
Yeah, she's a Chicagoan. I was able to find something about a design firm that was registered to the name Norma Barnes back in the 1970s or 80s, which would make a lot of sense. But that beyond the registration of the business itself, I couldn't find it attached to the specific person who went to those events. So it's super interesting. You know, she did show up at lots of those parties with him. And other than just being mentioned in the caption of the image, there was never more information shared about who she was or what her relationship was to Calvin Ashford.
Okay, that seems like a fruitful path to maybe keep going down a little bit.
Totally, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I think we will give you all the rest of your Friday afternoon. Thank you so much, Cotter and Will. We really appreciate it. And like I said, this video will be up on our YouTube channel probably in about a week. And just, I forgot to mention it earlier, but we do have a symposium planned for our 20th anniversary. The BMRC will be 20 years old next year on Black Chicago. So if anyone here would like to submit an abstract, the call is open right now. But thank you all once again. It was an excellent talk. We're so glad to be able to support this research, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.